Hey buddy, watch this.
Hello, Regis Gilbin is the name, and Hearthstone is the game. And this is my review of the nerf to the Caverns Below. That's right, if you haven't heard, Quest Rogue is getting nerfed. The card currently reads, play 4 minions of the same name to complete your quest, but in the very near future the card will read, in fact, play 5 minions with the same name to complete your quest. So Blizzard's just making it that little bit more difficult to actually complete the quest. And this might seem like a very small change, but I think it's going to have a ridiculous impact on what Hearthstone looks like in at least the near future before the next expansion comes out. So I have a few things I want to talk about in regards to this change. Essentially, is this going to kill the deck? How is the meta going to adapt to this change? Was this the right way to change the card? And what's it going to look like in the future of Hearthstone? Because remember, this card is going to be in standard format basically for 2 years, so that's a really important consideration. So first things first, is this nerf enough to kill Quest Rogue as a deck? And I think pretty unanimously the answer is yes. I think that, Quest Rogue is basically the kind of deck that is almost too inconsistent already. Sometimes it high rolls into those games where it completes the quest ridiculously quickly and just steamrolls opponents. But there's those other games where it just can't find the pieces and it's too busy addressing the board and they die before they can complete it. And that's a very fine line already. Because remember, Quest Rogue might feel like an impressive deck, but its win rate is not particularly absurd. I think it's pretty clearly a tier 1 deck still at this point, especially in the hands of really good players. It's a powerful deck at the high legend level, more so than like rank 15 or whatever it might be. But still, a very fine line and a very nice balance has been achieved in that regard. It's still incredibly frustrating to lose against, but it doesn't totally dominate the ladder like we've seen with some decks in Hearthstone's past. So I don't think this was an issue of balance necessarily in regards to nerfing this card. I think it was a lot more about just making the game feel better. But at the end of the day, I'm fairly confident that this change is going to be enough to make Quest Rogue that little bit more inconsistent. It's going to lose an extra game here, an extra game there, and basically, it might chop 3 to 5% off the win rate of this deck, which in the scheme of things is enough to kill it. It will become a tier 2 or tier 3 deck as we understand the meta right now, because it's just a little bit longer to complete, which means you give your opponent more time to kill you. It's more inconsistent, so control decks don't get ran over as fast and have more time to stabilize behind all their maybe taunts or board clears or whatever it might be. So yeah, I think Quest Rogue, as we currently understand it, the deck right now is not going to be good enough with this change. So this is a nerf, although very subtle and just a small tweak of one number, which is the right way to nerf things, still ultimately is enough to doom the deck. So that's my proclamation. I guess we'll have to see once this goes live if the deck can still somehow piece it together and win, but I really suspect Quest Rogue right now is done, much to the relief of many, many people. So the next natural question is if Quest Rogue, which is a very popular and prominent deck on the ladder, if it's going away, how is the meta going to adapt? And this is a very difficult thing to predict, but I think I can make at least one guess, right? And that's that Quest Rogue has a good way of keeping super greedy control decks in check. Because essentially with Quest Rogue, if you don't apply enough pressure to them in the early game and essentially kill them before they complete the quest, then you have a hard time losing. So super greedy control decks just don't have the answers. Things like Jade Druid, for instance, although also a popular deck on the ladder, is a very tough matchup with Quest Rogue because they just can't apply the pressure. Quest Rogue completes the quest. Jade Druid doesn't have the removal necessary, so Quest Rogue runs over them. There's a few other control matchups that are also really difficult to beat Quest Rogue. So if you take Quest Rogue out of the equation, I think what that does is that it opens the door for these really greedy control decks, and it basically allows people to play a little bit greedier and slower and have the confidence that they're not going to occasionally just hit those insta-loss games against Quest Rogue. You're taking the leash off Jade Druid, which means Jade Druid rises in popularity, and basically Jade Druid is the king of control versus control. So I think a lot of the other control decks probably go away. In fact, I think Mage is going to have a lot of difficulty against Jade Druid because that's just such a tough matchup with all the armor and the bodies that Jade Druid can just continue to throw at Mage. So I think Mage falls off. I think Taunt Warrior falls off because they can't beat Jade, and Jade is going to grow. And then I think what might actually happen, surprisingly, is I think Silence Priest might pick up, because Silence Priest is a control deck that can pull those kinds of crazy early game bodies and buff shenanigans to beat Jade Druid before they stabilize and get into their super late game potential. So I think Silence Priest and Jade Druid will pick up. I think Silence Priest will actually be a pretty dominant deck in the meta. That's a weird read, perhaps an interesting guess from my perspective, but I think it's going to happen. And then I think we'll still see the aggro decks that we see today with Pirate Warrior. They might actually become a little less good simply because they had a great matchup against Quest Rogue, and there was a little bit of a balance there. So we might see them fall off a tad and might see more of mid-range style stuff like the Murloc Paladins and Token Shamans. They're already popular. They might end up taking control and pushing Pirate Warrior out of the meta. But, all of that is just speculation. We have no idea. There might be a new deck that pops up that Quest Rogue was completely shutting out that we never saw because it just lost too many auto matchups there. The meta can always shift and move, and it flows, so who's to really say what's going to happen? But I know one thing for sure, that if Quest Rogue dies, the meta is going to have to adjust. So there's going to be a big shakeup here, not to mention, of course, a new expansion's probably not that far out in the scheme of things. We probably have 6 weeks until a new expansion hits, so there's going to be this month and a half period where the meta is really still finding its legs and stabilizing, and it's going to be shaken up again with a new expansion, so who really knows? But now I want to answer the question is, was this change to Caverns Below actually the right change, or was it the wrong change? And I think, unfortunately, the answer to this question is that it was the wrong change. I don't think this was the best way to fix Caverns Below, and let me explain why. Basically, the problem with Caverns Below was the variance that it had. So sometimes the Quest Rogue would just totally fail. Sometimes they'd hit the crazy draw and just go absolutely insane and hit the quest by turn 3, and you'd never have a shot. And it felt like there really weren't that many games in between. It was either way too fast, way too slow, automatic win, automatic loss. It felt like playing solitaire to some extent because you could never really interact with the Quest Rogue or influence their plays or decisions that much. It was basically just up to their draw and up to them not playing like a moron to satisfy the quest and beat you. And that was a really unfun way to play Hearthstone, and I'm glad that we're probably not going to experience that quite as much because I do think, as I mentioned, that the deck will die. But changing it in this way doesn't take away that negative aspect. In fact, this just increases the variance. So in other words, it's harder to high roll, but the high roll is still there, and it's still going to feel really frustrating when they high roll. In fact, it might feel even more frustrating because it's a more difficult thing to do, but they're still going to have those games where they just hit the nuts and they automatically win and there was nothing you could do about it. I think there were probably some other possible changes to the card that just kept it as consistent, or even maybe made it more consistent, but reduced the raw power output when it happened. And I made a video a long time ago, way back in April, right at the launch of Unguro, that proposed some changes. And if you go back and watch that video, I still think some of those changes would have been better. You could have done things like maybe make the minions 4/4s instead of 5/5s. So the quest is as consistent as it is now, but it doesn't feel quite as overwhelming once they complete it. The power output is reduced. There were a number of other changes in that video that all were focused more on consistency and lowering the variance of the card, while still essentially nerfing it or reducing its power level, but not totally breaking it. So the reason I think this is problematic is because even though this kills the card now, and everybody says, oh, what does it matter? The deck can't succeed. It's over. The era of Quest Rogue is done. Who cares if it's inconsistent? Well, my problem for that, and the final point I want to make in this video, is that Quest Rogue is not going away. It's in standard format basically for another 2 years. Not quite 2 years, but almost a full 2 years. So essentially, the crazy swing, the absurd variance, and the potential of this card to be really dominant when it finds success is still there. So for the next 2 years, Blizzard has to design around and consider and not fall into any traps where they release future cards that somehow make this slightly more consistent and bring it back into the spotlight. They have to make sure the meta doesn't shift in a way that if it's too slow, you give Quest Rogue more time and then it comes back with a vengeance and starts to dominate again, and it still has a really bad feeling negative impact on Hearthstone. So basically, this change, I think, just leaves the door open a little bit too much for a long time for this to potentially become an oppressively unfun deck once more. And if you did some other changes that reduced the variance and reduced the power output, so you got a little bit of a positive and a little bit of a negative, but the card remained balanced and felt like it landed somewhere in the middle, I think that would keep it a much healthier influence on the game for the remaining 2 years, and frankly the remaining lifespan of Hearthstone, where it's in wild format too, because basically now forever you have this extremely high variance card that feels awful to play against and has the potential to just run over Hearthstone's meta. So I don't really like this change as much as I'm happy Blizzard addressed the card and felt like there was a negative experience that needed improvement. All of those are great things. I'm just not sure they got it exactly right. So I'm a little bit torn there. I wish we could have seen something different. Perhaps a more complex change, because this is a very simple and elegant one, admittedly. But I think at the end of the day, a more complex change probably would have left the card in a better state for the future of Hearthstone. So, all that said, that's a really long review of one word being changed in a Hearthstone card. But of course, I do think this is an incredibly important one. And I'm really quite curious to hear what you guys think about the Caverns Below. What do you think about Quest Rogue? Did it need a nerf? Is this the right way to nerf it? What's it going to look like in the future? I want to hear your take, because I'm just one guy who doesn't always get it right, and sometimes I love to hear your insights because you guys often do get it right and have some great insights. So how do you feel about Quest Rogue? Was this the nerf it needed? I want to hear all of it in the comments below. But until then, thank you so much for watching, and until next time, game on.